Okay, we are live with Alexander Mercouris, and joining us on the Duran for the first time. We are very excited and very honored to have with us Dr. Neema Parvini, someone who has been requested by our viewers hundreds and hundreds of times to join us on a show. Dr. Parvini, thank you very much for joining us on the Duran. I have the links to your YouTube, your Substack, your website in the description box down below. Is there anything else that you would like to plug, or anywhere else people can follow your work?
Yeah, well, I mean, the two things I'll mention is that I have, due to the state of the British education system, I've set up something called the Academic Agency, where I sell courses. And one of the best-selling courses on there is the Classical Trivium, logic, writing, rhetoric. And, it's kind of non-ideological, but that is something I direct people towards because it's, they're only cheap compared to university courses, but a lot of people have had value from that, how to write a sentence, how to parse rhetoric, and how to make logical, valid and true arguments. The other thing I'll mention really quickly is that today, a lot of the ideas I'm going to be talking about can be found in my book, The Populist Illusion. There's also a follow-up called The Prophet of Doom, which is slightly less relevant to what we're going to be talking about today, although it is ultimately relevant because The Prophets of Doom is about the rise and fall of civilizations. And much of the state of the UK does feel like a nation in decline. So I would say both of those books are relevant if people are interested.
Great. I will add those links as a pinned comment as well when we finish the live stream. So let's get started and begin this the show. Real quick, Alexander, just a quick hello to everybody that's watching us on all our platforms, and a big shout out to our amazing, awesome moderators, Alexander, Dr. Parvini. Let's get started.
Indeed, let's get started. Now, we're in the middle of a general election in Britain. I'm going to say straight away, I have lived through 15. I did a count just before we started. I go back all the way to 1970. I do not know of a single general election that has been as bleak and as sad for me personally as the one we're going through at the moment. And it does seem to me, Dr. Parvini spoke about Britain being a nation in decline. I think that is true. And I think that there is no better person to discuss that with than with Dr. Parvini, who is, of course, an academic in Britain at the University of Buckingham, I believe, but also a person who's written extensively about these matters. He mentioned the book called The Populist Illusion, which we will come to. He's also written Prophets of Doom, which covers people like Julius Evola, Oswald Spengler, Arnold Toynbee, Gobineau, all sorts of heavyweight figures of that kind who've written about decline in various ways and problems. Sorokin, Bidirim Sorokin, and also about defenders of liberty, which is a very interesting, important book as well. Now, Dr. Parvini, I think with that introduction, that short introduction, I think the best thing to do, since we never have unlimited amount of time in these programs, is to go directly and to ask you for your thoughts about the election and about why it's playing out in this bleak way that it is. At least I think it's bleak, and what your general thoughts are.
Well, I mean, the first thing I'll say is that I, like everybody else in this country, have been absolutely disgusted with the Conservative government of the last 14 years, and particularly in the last 2 or 3 years. I have never known the country to be in such a sorry state. We received an email the other day. I live in the southeast, but from a water company saying, "Oh, the water, you need to buy 3 days worth of bottled water because we may have poisoned the water supply." And that to me is kind of symbolic of the sorry state. I mean, nothing works. We're talking kind of real, practical, everyday things. And the state of the high street in most towns now, the sense of kind of dilapidation and decline is everywhere. For that reason, I have been calling for the past several weeks for the Tory party to get 0 seats. In fact, I put out a couple of kind of spoof videos and things like that with some help from some friends. And I've been quite stunned by the extent to which that small thing, which I just put up on my YouTube channel and on my Twitter feed, has traveled very far and very wide. It's been picked up by lots of people who I don't know. And it seems like it kind of captures a feeling in the country, which is that this Tory government has been so bad on so many different issues. I mean, the biggest of which is immigration, by the way, that the country has had enough. Now, I watched a video that you guys put out called "The Uniparty Agrees to the General Election." And I happen to agree with a lot of the analysis that you said, that this was a kind of an attempt by what we call the regime to shut out insurgents. However, I do have a slightly different. I have the view that if the Tory party are low enough, i.e., if we get as close to 0 seats as possible, the Labour Party actually will be in a worse position than if the Tories have more seats, because essentially they'll have to carry the can, i.e., it will be unambiguous that they are in control, and Keir Starmer then will have to deliver on some of his election pledges. And my hope is that the victory for Labour is actually so big that it destroys what I would call political kayfabe. That is the notion that there are actually two different parties. And we can talk a bit more about that later on. I do know that other people, yourselves included, are a bit more pessimistic about the prospect of Keir Starmer. But my view is that the regime is actually in so much trouble that it needs to make some containment moves. And again, later on, I'll explain exactly what I mean by containment.
Right. Well, that is interesting. It's not impossible that the Conservatives might go down to maybe not 0, but I've seen one poll which says 66 seats, which would be, I think, a catastrophic collapse for a Conservative Party which has dominated the political landscape in Britain with important interruptions, well, since the 19th century, the late 19th century, when it basically established itself as the dominant party in Britain. But I'm interested that you think that a huge Labour victory might be, in some respects, an opening, provide opportunities. And perhaps you could enlarge on this, because you're quite right in saying that, we look at the situation, the two of us do, and certainly I do, and I don't find very much inspiring in the Labour Party at all. And, inspiring is obviously an important word, because you can find things inspiring and still disagree with them very strongly. But I just don't find very much of anything. But anyway, perhaps you can explain why this titanic thing, if it comes, this massive Labour landslide, if it comes, might provide a way forward.
Well, there's actually two things. The first is that kayfabe is a term taken from professional wrestling. Okay, you will know, for example, that once upon a time, Andre the Giant and Hulk Hogan had a massive match at WrestleMania 3. Okay, and they were deadly enemies. Okay, but of course, in real life, WrestleMania 3 was an event put on by Vince McMahon, and Andre the Giant and Hulk Hogan were the best of friends behind closed doors, and they were actually cooperating. Okay, and it was predetermined that Andre the Giant would lose on that occasion. Okay, and that Hulk Hogan would remain the champion. Now, in many ways, Western liberal democracies have developed that this dynamic is essentially there. That is why you call it the uniparty, right? Everybody knows that the Labour and the Tories are not the worst of enemies, just like Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant. Okay. Now, what that does, that dynamic of Labour versus Tories, is it gives both parties constant kind of ephemera, froth, that they can deflect from the actual business of governance and of, solving the problems in the country. So for example, under normal circumstances, if Labour got back in, but the Tories had, let's say, I don't know, 250 seats or something, they could constantly deflect by saying, well, look at who this politician is cheating on their wife with, or that they can just, I mean, one of the flim flam issues of today is the issue of kind of transgenderism. The Tory party made a tweet yesterday saying, well, at least we can say what a woman is, right? Well, these are kind of symbolic matters that matter actually to they actually affect a very small number of people. And in this way, they can basically direct everybody's attention to these fake fights and not deal with things like potholes in the road and the fact that Hammersmith Bridge has been closed for 5 years and all of the other terrible things in this country. So what I'm hoping is that if that dynamic was broken enough, and that if there was such a kind of rump left of the Tory party, that Labour would have no choice but to concentrate on the actual governance. And the international dynamic is important here as well, because it does seem like they're gearing up for something, some conflict, war, and maybe the actual reality is dawning on what has frankly been a delusional elite over the past couple of decades will finally mean that they actually have to sort some of these things out, even if it's for the very, very cynical purpose of getting people to enlist so they can die in their wars.
Gosh, let's talk about the elite, because I know you've written about elites and about the control of elites over societies, and I think in Britain we're becoming increasingly exposed, even those of us who've actually had these illusions, that in fact there are real party politics taking place and parties are different from each other and that they fight each other. But I think even over the last couple of years, it's become very difficult to take this entirely seriously anymore. I can remember a time when there were differences between parties, but certainly at the moment there are. But perhaps you can discuss this. Can you, discuss elites generally, and perhaps if you can discuss elites in particular, the British elite in particular, and what we're looking at the moment?
Yeah. So, I mean, a lot of the stuff I've written on is taken from something called elite theory. If people are interested, most of the ideas I'm going to talk about go back to people like Pareto, Giordano Mosca, Robert Michels, and some other thinkers as well, like Carl Schmitt, who was German and in fact involved with the government in Germany in the mid-century there, Bertrand de Juvenel and people like this, if people are interested. But the first thing you need to do is to kind of step back and try to think about what is the nature of government and power, okay? And there are a number of different principles which I will just outline briefly for the audience so that people can kind of keep up with this discussion. The first thing is that power is always, everywhere and always, the organized minority over the disorganized mass, okay? In the West, we have this partly due to the myths of the 1960s and people like Martin Luther King and so on. We have this notion that power is bottom up, that the people are sovereign and the leaders listen to the people. But this has only ever been a delusion. In fact, there's plenty of evidence to show that even the 1960s was an elite project. Christopher Colwyn, I think, shows that very well in his recent book. So the organized minority over the disorganized mass. Okay, this is everywhere and always. Think of an army. You want to take out the officers, because without that, the 100 organized men will be able to defeat the 1,000 disorganized men 10 times out of 10. Okay. The second thing is that power seeks to eliminate rival castles. A rival castle is basically anything that is a genuine threat to power. Think of the way the Bolsheviks simply eliminated the kulaks, or Henry VIII taking out the Catholic Church, or you can name your own examples from history. So and this is always happens, given a long enough time frame. The third thing is that, and this will be the one at which you, Alexander, may, as a man of a legal man, may balk at the most. Power will make exceptions to the rule of law for its friends and enemies. That is, the normal rule of law will be suspended when friends are concerned, and it will be applied extra especially harshly when enemies are concerned. And I think any Americans in the audience will see the treatment of Donald Trump and be very quickly able to see that for themselves in real time. The fourth thing is that power will legitimate itself with political formulas. My shorthand for this is simply BS, 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 therefore I rule. Okay? The BS, people might call it ideology, it could be a religion, but essentially people have to buy into that for the regime to be legitimate. So our BS is something like we live in a free society, a liberal democracy, or it has been. And what we're seeing is that people are no longer believing that, and they're seeing the BS for what it is. And the fifth thing is that because of all of this, states tend to converge around single stories, i.e. there's a tendency towards what you might call in political terms absolutism, even if that absolutism is hidden with these kind of stories and myths that you tell yourself. Now, to make all of this easier to understand, there's a number of examples I will give out. Okay, these things I have been talking about are true of every system. So when George Orwell wrote 1984, he wasn't talking about Stalin's USSR or even about Hitler's Germany. He was talking about Britain, Britain under Clement Attlee as it had been under the Allies. In 1941, James Burnham pointed out that all three of the powers in the war, that is FDR's USA, the USSR, and Germany, and of course Britain, had effectively become, by that point, total managerial states. Now, no one has a problem with the notion that Stalin would not have tolerated any non-Stalinist in his government, or that Hitler would not tolerate any non-Nazi in his government. But partly because of the lies liberal democracies tell themselves, people have a harder time seeing this with our elites, okay? But our elites are just as intolerant of rival castles. In other words, power is not going to tolerate anyone but their friends in government. And the moment I want to take everybody back to is the 2010 general election, when it was Gordon Brown, David Cameron, and Nick Clegg in the debate. Do you remember? I agree with Nick. Do you remember that?
Absolutely.
This was the apex moment of the current neoliberal elite. And the system is constantly trying to get back to that moment where it was Clegg, basically three flavors of Tony Blair. Okay. Now, it's sorry that I monologue a bit, but these things are important to understand. It's sometimes easier to see all of this through analogy with nations that the West typically criticize as being autocratic, such as Putin's Russia or Iran under the Ayatollah. Okay. Now, both of those systems, but that is both Russia's and Iran's, are technically democracies. Okay. Iran's constitution was actually modeled after the French Revolution. But everybody knows that whether its president is Raisi or Khatami or Ahmadinejad, who actually within the Iranian political system represent different positions in the parameters of allowable opinion in that country. But everybody knows that regardless of who the president is, the real ruling class are the mullahs. And in Russia, it's even more transparent. Putin is in charge. Friends of Putin get positions in the government. Enemies of Putin, well, you know what happens to them. They end up in jail or they get put in prison. The point is that our system is basically identical to this. All of those things happen in our system too. In Iran, candidates are pre-selected by something called the Guardian Council. That is, no one who is truly anti-regime will be allowed to run. In this country, candidates are screened for political correctness. And again, truly anti-regime candidates will be weeded out. Some people may know that just before Nigel Farage took over Reform UK, which happened yesterday, Richard Tice had deselected many candidates who were deemed unacceptable by what is essentially a far leftist activist organization called Hope Not Hate. We watched Keir Starmer purge dozens of candidates in the past couple of weeks who will not toe the party line on Israel. The Tories have routinely gate-kept out anyone who was actually conservative from the Tory party since David Cameron got in. So the function of the Guardian Council in Iran is carried out here by another name. And the last thing I'll say, and this is something that I have been particularly hard on in the past couple of years, because this is much more difficult for people to see. But I think the two of you will recognize it more because you look at countries other than our own on a regular basis, which is that all regimes have more advanced tricks that they have up their sleeve. Okay, and the biggest trick is something called containment. Okay, where you can contain dissident energy to look like you're doing what people want in order to stay in power. Again, to use Iran as the example, Khatami, who I mentioned, was a reformer. Ahmadinejad was the Iranian equivalent of a nationalist populist. Note he didn't wear the turban, he was secular leader. Raisi, who's just died, was a hardliner. Now, everybody knows that ultimately, regardless of which one of these is in power, which one of these is the president, the regime maintains control. But it's actually useful for the regime to kind of vent, to allow people who have the same opinions as, say, Ahmadinejad or Raisi to kind of feel like they've been listened to. And it's like a pressure valve is released. I'll note, by the way, that once Ahmadinejad, who was useful for a period there when it was peak neocon era in the 2000s, once his usefulness was over, he was not allowed to run in 2012. And similar dynamics play out in this country where the parties tactically pivot to what is allowable opinion. In fact, during that same period of when Ahmadinejad was a president, there was a lot of what I would call allowable bigotry that entered into the British and the American political discourse of that time. When that was no longer politically convenient, again, after about 2010, that was called Islamophobia. But when they were trying to get people up for the Iraq war, it was actually actively fomented by Hollywood movies and by newspapers and all the rest of it. And getting people to see, so I think people can see a lot of the other things I talked about, but this particular move, I think, is more difficult for people to see. And it also creates difficulties for our analysis because it's not always clear who is containment and who is not. For example, this election was looking to be a bit of a damp squib. Let's face it. But then yesterday, sensationally, to use my wrestling analogy, like Stone Cold Steve Austin with a chair, Nigel Farage dramatically announces he's going to run. Now, is that a genuine threat to the regime, or is Farage part of the regime? And frankly, at this point, it's very hard to tell. So over to you guys.
Gosh, just to quickly say, I'm not the point about lawyers. There is a thing that lawyers say to each other. It's not widely known, but they say two things. One is bullshit baffles brains, which is very much part of what lawyers do. But the other, about specifically the point you said, is that it's a well-known phrase going all the way back to antiquity that the law catches small flies but cannot hold big ones. It's like a spider's web. It can only catch the small flies. The big ones, the well-connected people, they've always been able to fly away. What I would say is, and this is important about the administration of law, is that it has to look convincing. And I think that one of the things that has been happening in the United States to an extreme degree, I think over the last few months, but years as well, but also increasingly in Britain too, is that the fiction that the law is impartial and administered evenly is starting to look very threadbare, and the problems are becoming visible. And that brings me to the next point, because of course, what you said about the fact that there is an elite behind, always in control. The one writer that you mentioned, whom I'm familiar with, is Michel's, who I think said that, behind every political system, there is always an oligarchy that actually controls things. And I think one of the most powerful thinkers, and by the way, amongst those, I think is true, but there are competent oligarchies and there are less competent oligarchies. And I do get the sense that in Britain, at least, there has been a decline in oligarchical or elite competence, which has been underway for a fair amount of time, but which has now become again visible. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I was watching the other day a BBC documentary, which you guys may have seen, called Putin versus the West. Do you guys see that? I mean, there was a lot of propaganda in it, but it's notable because a lot of heavyweights, Theresa May, David Cameron, Boris Johnson. I mean, I say heavyweights, people of prominence. Let's just put it that way. And anyway, the episode I was watching went back to 2011, where there was this big light show put on in St. Petersburg. You may remember this. And apparently Putin at that time was furious about what was happening in Syria. And the light show was delayed. It was delayed until like 1 a.m. or something. And the meeting with David Cameron was going to take place at 2:30 a.m. in the morning. And Putin basically wanted to confront Cameron over Syria. Okay, a very, very serious diplomatic moment in history. And David Cameron was sitting there smugly. And I mean, you could see that he was pleased with himself by the look on his face. And he said, at this moment, this is when I raise with Putin the issue of LGBT rights. As if I mean, this is not a serious person. This is somebody who, is playing. Putin is whatever you make of him, he is a serious actor on the world stage, and Cameron is talking essentially about playground issues here, and I do think there's been a marked decline even from Tony Blair to David Cameron. I think Tony Blair, whatever you make of him, is actually a kind of truly Machiavellian figure who understands implicitly, whether he knows it or not, many of the things that I've talked about. Whereas the Tory party, since the Cameron takeover, really has been pathetic. So,
There's what has brought about this elite degeneration? I know that you've been interested in the educational system, which is an issue that I'm quite interested in as well. I get the sense that there has been aspects of the educational system that have been going seriously wrong. And of course, you also mentioned the fact that there is a kind of operation underway to police comments and discussions, very aggressive one, which is making it more difficult for discussion to take place in any form about economic matters as well, but mostly about these social questions, which also impacts on politics too. I mean, are these things connected? Is it partly, as I said, is it a product of the way the education system is organized? Because I have to say this, again, I speak as somebody who has, whose wife works in higher education. It is certainly a concern of hers. Anyway, what are your thoughts about this?
Well, I mean, this may not be very, very popular thing to say, but I actually think that it was a mistake to open up the universities for 50% plus of the population. Speaking of Tony Blair, that was one of his banner policies. The analogy I will always make is to pineapples. Okay, once upon a time, a pineapple was a status symbol, right? In fact, it was so difficult to get hold of a pineapple in the West and in Britain that people would literally, they put a pineapple up on their mantelpiece and it would rot it'd be like a rotting pineapple there, but they wanted to show people that they could get one, and the value of it came from hence. And obviously, once you could buy pineapples in tins, they were two a penny. Nobody thinks of a pineapple as something that's going to be, make anybody else think more highly of you. And of course, with education, once you democratize it, a similar thing is going to take place. Not only will the perceived value of degrees go down, but also, just like you have to standardize the production of pineapple cans, you also have to standardize education to the point where it has to appeal to the to the lowest baseline. I mean, I remember when I used to give lectures, I was lecturing ostensibly on Shakespeare, but I'd have to take the first 2 lectures to fill in 1,000 years worth of European history, because they didn't have it. If I said the Renaissance, for example, or the Elizabethan era, kids did not have a sense of where in history that was. I'll never forget. I won't name any individual students, obviously, but I'll never forget that I received an essay once that I marked, and it started in the Victorian era, William Shakespeare, and it was just like, I know, just silly student error, but this is what I'm talking about. It's like that there is something about the way education has gone that means a lot of people just have very little knowledge of things that would have been standard even a few years ago. And even in our lifetime, like, I'm a fairly educated guy, but I cannot speak fluent Greek and Latin, which would have been absolutely standard, 50 years before me. So I even think there's been a decline from the professors who would have taught me to me, because the things that have led to this, I think, is a combination of certain technologies that have impacted the way people process information, but also the role of wealth cannot be overlooked. Comfort. A lot of the periods that people look back on and think, well, this was a great moment, well, this produced a lot of great things, tend to come from struggle. They tend to come from a sense that you're up against it. And frankly, since World War II, in what I would call the moment of the American empire, because let's face it, that's what we're living in, people have been too comfortable, and it has led to decline across the board, including decline at the elite level. So, yeah.
Are we locked into decline then? Because I think one of the points that you made, perhaps you can enlarge upon it, is that when we're looking at conflicts, when we're looking at, essentially, it's the displacement of one elite by another. I'm undoubtedly not explaining your ideas clearly, but if you can explain them as well. The trouble is, I don't see at the moment in Britain an alternative elite in a position to take over, to replace the one we have. So that elite is getting less competent, but I don't really see rivals to it at the moment. I don't see any organizing forces that might be rivals to it. I don't see signs of social movements that might crystallize different elites, like you've seen in other places, like you saw in France, in the United States at one time, in Russia too. So, anyway, just over to you.
Yeah, one thing I should say is that the British system is the best in the world, and even Mosca recognized this when he was writing back at the turn of the 20th century. The British system has always been the best in the world at containing dissident energy, and what we have watched from Brexit to now has been an absolute masterclass by the ruling establishment, likes of Tony Blair, literally Tony Blair and his institute, and other forces like that, of locking down, of basically shutting out dissident energies. The Corbyn takeover of Labour has been completely reversed. I mean, completely purged in a ruthless and almost brutal way. They managed to tie up Brexit and reconfigure it and subvert what Brexit was meant to be. Most, I mean, I voted Remain, by the way. Typical anywhere liberal elite as I am now. I'm only joking, but I did vote Remain. But a lot of the people who voted Brexit were voting as a kind of FU to the system. They were voting on immigration, and the Tory party basically took that and they inverted it. They said, actually, you're voting for a more global Britain. The problem with the EU is that the EU is too racist, and it gives us scope to bring in more people from outside. And that is exactly what they've done, by the way. I think was it 2.4 million people have arrived in the past 3 or 4 years. And I read a statistic the other day, 43% of all of the people born outside the UK have arrived in the past 10 years. I mean, it's just extraordinary. But so what I think has happened now, though, if we can get back to the election, is that their ability to use all these little tricks, these persuasion tools, these framing devices, these selection games that they play. I actually think that in this election, which has been designed, as you guys correctly pointed out, to keep out those dissident energies, I think they are now so overwhelming, so in your face, that the problems with the country, that even the British establishment is struggling to prevent happening here what has happened all around Europe, in Italy with Salvini and Meloni, Wilders in the Netherlands, Le Pen, AfD in Germany. And in fact, if you notice, both of the parties, both Labour and Tories, have made immigration a central issue. In fact, last night I read through a Sun article, which was an exclusive interview with Keir Starmer, where Keir Starmer's platform sounds like something that, if anybody had come out with it 5 years ago, would have been instantly branded far right and booed at by people on Question Time. But now Labour have made it a central manifesto pledge for the election. And the reason they're doing that is that, and this is something that Tony Blair has talked about openly many, many times, they believe that the elites now, if they can actually get a grip on this issue and reduce the immigration numbers and solve some of the problems that have given rise to populism in the first place, they'll be able to head it off at the pass and restore faith in the system. And that may work, but there's a lot of reason to believe that they may not make good on their promises. So that's up to people to decide for this election.
So in a sense, if we have a Labour landslide, there's possible chance that the elite might start to do what elites are supposed to do, which is to keep things operating functionally. But again, if they don't do that, if things continue to slide, in effect, they've created a larger target. Am I misconstructing this?
That is essentially the gambit that I wish to play. I mean, if I had total control over what would happen, that's what I would seek. Because in order to, I think it was Lenin who said something like, in order to bring down a system, you need to find its weakest link, right? Well, right now the weakest link is the Tory party. If we can, through our voting, destroy the Tory party, who are the central node of containment, by the way, I'm talking about, they are the biggest accelerators of decline. They're effectively a pure traitor party, in my view. If we can take those out, it presents the Labour Party with a very big problem. And in fact, sorry to go back to Tony Blair again, but there's an anecdote that he wrote in his book My Journey. he told an anecdote that on the night of the 1997 election, the results started coming in, and it was showing like dozens and dozens, hundreds of Labour seats, and the Tories were just on 6 at that moment in the night. And he said everybody else around me was ecstatic, but he started to freak out because he believed that he may have done something unconstitutional. He said, I wanted a handsome victory, but I didn't want to wipe the Tories out, because Blair, as a true student of politics, understands the structural role that the other party plays in a two-party system. They need each other. So if we can take one of them out, regardless of what the Labour Party do, it will be good. It will make all of these things that we've been talking about more clear. And also it will, I also hope Nigel Farage gets in, by the way, because I've just got a vision of George Galloway and Nigel Farage sitting next to each other in the House of Commons, holding Starmer's feet to the fire so that he can't start backpedaling on a lot of these pledges that he's making. And so, frankly, if the elites don't start listening to the population, then we may see what Pareto has called the circulation of elites. That is, if this lot aren't going to listen to us, that is when you get a completely disgruntled population who feel like they're not being listened to, and they feel like there aren't any routes out, there's no exit. That's when you start getting up. That is when you start getting uprisings. So, and frankly, just to talk about America for a quick second, I've been waiting for the common sense, because what I'm talking about is the common sense thing to do, right, from the Starmer government. And I've been waiting for common sense and kind of sensible kind of principles of power to kick in America. And they just don't do it. They just keep on accelerating towards crazier and crazier outcomes. So, Lord knows what will happen over there. But I actually expect the Starmer government to be marginally better than the Tory one, which I know will shock a lot of people.
Well, it could hardly be worse.
Yeah, exactly.
One thing to say. I think we've heard I think you provided us with a huge amount to think about, actually. And certainly I'm going to go away and think about this. I'm going to stop now, and I'm going to hand over to Alex. He might have some questions. If you can stay for just a little while. I know you're always busy. I know how busy academics can be. But I'm just going to hand over to Alex if there's any questions that you
just
can
put
like
two, three questions.
Just to say also thank you very much. My wife is floating upstairs listening to this program as well, just to say.
All right, two, 3 questions. Is that all right, Dr. Parvini? Yeah. Mm-hmm. From Russell Hall, be careful what you wish for. Destroying the illusion of multiple parties by handing absolute power to one party may permanently cement single party rule. Your thoughts?
Well, the thing is that, in the book, The Populist Illusion, I talked about how power is almost always top down. Okay. But I think some people sometimes misunderstand that. Okay. Regardless of what the system is, whether it's a king or a dictator or whoever, whatever the system is, there is a kind of tacit agreement whereby the population have to be okay. They have to buy into the legitimacy of that government. And once that is gone, it's actually quite difficult for elites to just kind of hold power through force indefinitely. And I think the example of the Soviet Union showed that. Okay, it took 80 years, but basically those elites just gave up. They stopped believing in their own BS, and they lost the will to rule. So they can get away with a lot. People in power can get away with a lot, but the elastic is not indefinite. And if they try to stretch it too far, there are consequences to that. And that is why, leaders have to engage in what I call containment. The correct way to think about Magna Carta as a famous example is that it was King John skillfully containing dissident energy in the country in order to remain in power, which is ultimately what happened. And that is the wise thing to do. So if they go down if they become more and more authoritarian, that sort of stuff is just not gonna, it's not gonna wash with a population who have been used to believing that that we live in liberalism and in freedom and so on. It takes quite a lot. The other thing I'll just mention really quickly is that Pareto, following Machiavelli, outlined two different types of elite: a fox elite and a lion elite. Now a lion elite relies on force in order to get things done. You think of Stalin or Saddam Hussein; these are lion leaders, okay, and they're used to using force. We have lived under, since 1945, foxes. And foxes rule through persuasion and perception management. This is why PR is so important in our system. If our regime tried to change from being a fox-based elite to being a lion elite, that will be an extremely difficult transition. And one of the things they talk about is that foxes struggle to use hard power. And when they do, it always comes across as being clumsy. The example I would give is Justin Trudeau. Do you remember when he started cracking down on the protest over the lockdowns or whatever it was? You know, it came off terribly. And so there's a big question to be asked of how far they're prepared to go. And it is actually, you know, to go back to the example of Iran, which I've drawn on a few times, it is to quote Spengler, the hour of decision for any regime. When the Shah in 1979 told his generals to open fire on the crowd, they said, we're not going to do it. And that was it. And so if they keep on going down that route, that time will come also for our governments. But I actually, against so much evidence, counterintuitively, I believe there are enough clever people, competent people in the elite to prevent that from happening, at least in the short term. You know, I mean, who knows? They could put Trump in jail, and I'll look like an idiot in 6 months' time. But I somehow believe that more of them are going to come to their senses. That seems to be what's happening at the moment.
Let me put this one up here. Marcos 588. One of Dr. Parvini's friends describes it well: complacency of the oligarchs and their apparatchiks, intentional neglect of our institutions, the phenomenon of bio-Leninism across all Western social strata.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd agree with that. And just to explain for people who aren't familiar with the concept of bio-Leninism, this is where, over time, people are selected for their loyalty to the regime over their skills and talents. And it's named after what happened in the Soviet Union when the Bolsheviks stopped selecting people because of their abilities and just selected them because they knew they were going to be loyal. And much of what people call woke, or the woke phenomena, or DEI, diversity, and all of this sort of thing, it's just that. Because if you've been hired, or if you're in a position, not because of your skills and talents, but because you tick the right boxes, you know it's at the back of your mind that you owe your position because of your loyalty to the regime. And you know, this is not unique, by the way, to the West. All regimes have this problem, including, I'm sure it even happens in Iran. I know it happens in Iran, but I'm sure it also happens to some extent in Russia as well. So
let's do a couple of more. Ronald McNugget says, it seems AA is saying these elites won't abandon mass migration or actually fix anything. Pure managed decline.
No, I actually believe that they will at least be seen to start to fix these problems, because they have to at some point say, we've listened to you, we understand, and we're going to do something about it. if only to take the energy out of what fuels populism everywhere. So because they know that nobody believes them, so they need to make a big show. And this is one of the strange dynamics in British politics. The way I put it is, people like David Cameron and Boris Johnson and so on, they lay awake at night thinking about what will be written about them in The Guardian or in The Independent. Whereas Blair, Mandelson, and now Keir Starmer, they stay awake at night thinking about what's written about them in The Sun and the Daily Mail and the Telegraph. So there's a very perverse thing where the Tory party virtue signals to its left and the Labour Party virtue signals to its right. But because a lot of people will only begrudgingly vote Labour, they then have to prove that they are the things that they're going to say they're going to be in a way that the Tories do not. Because the Labour can take left-wingers for granted. That may actually not be true in this election, but usually they can take people on the left for granted because they know they're just not going to vote for Tory. So they have to work for the votes of the people in the middle and the centre-right. And I will say, for as bad as a rap that Tony Blair gets, he did do a lot of things that by today's standards would seem quite, again, far right. Do you remember ASBOs, the hostile environment, 90% rejection rate of asylum seekers, David Blunkett saying he'd shoot prisoners with a machine gun? This was, tough on crime and the causes of crime. Labour have to play that game if they want to be in power. They'll talk tough on law and order, on immigration, and on the military, because they know that those are the areas that people don't trust them. And economy. People don't trust Labour on economy. Unfortunately for the Tories, people now don't trust them on anything at all. So that's why they're facing the 0 seats. Yeah.
And one more from Marcos 588. Do the Gracchi, Sulla, and Caesar make the cracks appear, or do they arise due to cracks appearing first? Or is it elements of both occurring in unison?
Yeah, one of the things I would say is that, and James Burnham, I mentioned, is particularly big on this point, is that most regimes collapse not because of an insurgency or the coming of a Caesar or the coming of some external threat. Most of them collapse internally due to a loss of will from the elites. So it's not to say that those other figures, those figures rising, are not a factor, but they tend to be a symptom of something that has gone wrong with the ruling class in the first place. It is often, and that is a difficult thing, I think, for a lot of people to get their heads around. It is not that Lenin rose to power because millions of people around Russia wanted communism. It is actually that the previous ruling class, the Tsars, had they had lost their way and they had lost their ability to rule. And it just so happens that Lenin and the Bolsheviks were the most organized minority, and they took over control in the vacuum, because power cannot abhor a vacuum. Somebody has to take over. And in fact, to go back to the Iranian case, the exact same thing happened there. The Shah had lost his way, and he'd lost the ability to rule and the will to rule. And he was actually overthrown by a vast coalition of all sorts of people from across Iranian society. It just so happened that the mullahs and the Ayatollah was the most organized minority. And after he got into power, after initially saying that he'd go into the mountains and be a holy man, he ruthlessly crushed his rival castles, and now they are the ruling class. And so it was with Hitler in Germany, and any other case where you have the collapse of one system and the coming in of another system. So that's my long answer to that.
Fantastic. Dr. Parvini, love AA, love the Duran. Thanks, guys. Thank you very much. Academic Agent, AA. Dr. Parvini, thank you for joining us on the Duran. I have your information where people can follow you in the description box down below. I will also add the links as a pinned comment as well. Thank you so much for joining us on this show.
Thank you very
Thanks,
much,
guys.
Dr. Parvini.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Much to
Wow.
think there. Much to think about there, indeed.
A
Yeah.
lot to think about.
Yeah.
Let's answer the remaining questions, Alexander. And we do have a lot to think about. That was.
By the way, can
incredible.
I just say, just to
Yeah.
quickly say, I've started working through these books. They are compelling and they're very, very readable. So if you really want to read really good analysis of political thinking, get a sense of the state of things, follow up all the points that we've been hearing today, go to these various books. You can find them all on Amazon. Defenders of Liberty, Prophets of Doom, The Populist Illusion, they're all there.
Yeah, it would be great to have Dr. Parvini on again.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Be interesting to see whether things turn out the way he wants, and we really do get a Conservative Party that's down to zero. They don't deserve
Zero
anything
seats.
better. 0 seats. They really do not deserve anything better.
Yeah. Fragments of the USSR says, I recall the call in ear when I asked if you've heard of Academic Agent. Both you said no. I recommended him to you. Glad that you finally met, gentlemen. Thank you for that.
We
Fragments
did
of
indeed.
USSR.
We followed.
Yes. Ralph Steiner says, Dear Alex Alexander, I would like once again to plead for the intercession in the restoration of the chat rights of John Ashley Smith so that he can keep on chatting in the free world. Very much appreciate it. Yes, Ralph, we will do that. Absolutely. Let's see. Fragments of the USSR said, Trump said he is going across the border after the cartels. Alexander, Orlov was right. The group behind Rand want a new war on terror against international crime. Their candidate is Trump.
Well, interesting. I mean, what end one war, start another, which is not to say, of course, that the problems of the cartels aren't real and that there isn't real problems, that they don't create real problems. But whether this is the right way, I am skeptical. One of the things, and this is not, a theory, it's been looked at academically. There have been studies about this going back decades. One of the great problems with the international trade that the cartels are involved in is that there is so much complicity and collusion with them from the very highest circles of power, including in the United States itself. You go back all the way to the 1960s, for example, the French Connection in Marseille, famous from that film, smuggling heroin into the United States. They were able to get help from the French secret services and the US secret services because they were seen as a force to control Marseille, where there was a powerful communist party. So that, I think, is the better way. It's to actually go through the government, say to themselves, look, we've got to be united about this. We really want to get on top of this problem of this international trade, not go into Mexico, but actually not to assist all the time these people in doing the things that they do.
Patty and Patsy, thank you for that super sticker. Elza says, how important is the outcome of the election in the UK? Does it have an impact on European and international politics?
I was about to say that it's not going to have much importance because we're looking at, two parts of one elite. One part is going to replace another, but overall the politics can't change. But the thing about Britain is that for whatever reason, it does make the weather to some extent. There's a conservative collapse, and be very clear, the Zelensky curse will be playing a role in that. I mean, the fact that they were involved in all of this, that if there's a Conservative Party collapse like that, it might shake things up in other places as well. But that collapse has to happen first, and we'll see if it does.
Ralph Steiner says the illusion of freedom will continue as long as it's profitable to continue the illusion. At the point where the illusion becomes too expensive to maintain, they will just take down the scenery.
I know. Here, by the way, I do agree with Dr. Parvini. It is not easy for foxes to become lions. Um, it, if they go too obviously against that system which they've constructed, and it's a system, it's not just a system of police and security forces and that kind of thing. It's also a system of ideas as well. If they go against it too openly, then they will bring everything down, including themselves.
I thought the example of Trudeau was excellent with the truckers
Excellent,
protests.
absolutely.
That was an
Very,
excellent
very
example. Yeah, the fox in line.
excellent.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, Graciano, thank you for that super sticker. Ralph Steiner said they will pull back the curtains. They will move the tables and chairs out of the way, and you will see the brick wall at the back of the theater. Frank Zappa.
Very good. That's very, very good indeed.
Very good.
Frank Zappa is great, by the way. Just saying.
Russell Hall says, just once, I'd like for people who throw out the talking point of Putin jailing political adversaries to provide a list of examples besides Navalny.
Well, yes, I understand that, and this one could go over this many times. So I have done. Let's not get distracted and focus instead on the very, very searching analysis that we've just heard.
From Mark Hewitt, did you see Neil Oliver's monologue on Bojo, the clown parading with an NAZI flag and the lieutenant colonel attempt to cover for the Azov?
I have not seen it, but I have heard about it, and a lot of people I know have commented about this, and it's something I absolutely do want to see. I'm afraid that it's another example of the decline and fall of Johnson. Once upon a time, I say this about him, he had more understanding of how to conduct politics than he seems to today.
Yeah. Ralph Steiner says, government is a true religion. It has its dogmas, its mysteries, its priests. To submit it to the individual discussion is to destroy it. It is given life only through the national mind. That is to say, by political faith, which is a creed. Joseph de Maistre.
Interesting. Okay. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. Sancho Relaxo says, do these new incompetent elites actually believe in overpopulation, in imminent eco-doom, in zero-sum outcomes?
I don't think so. I think that, again, one shouldn't perhaps overestimate how deeply they think. They do understand power, and I think that is something that Dr. Parvini was talking about, or at least they did. But I don't think they really believe in these things. And as I said, if they do, then it's very bad news for them, because what they're playing with is fire, which will burn them.
Alex Glantz, thank you for that super sticker. Joe Nata Games, welcome to the Duran community. Peter Gustafson, thank you for that super sticker. Jimbo Elrad, welcome to the Duran community. Tim Gibson, thank you for that awesome super sticker. Marcos 588 says, a tour de force with a wonderful guest. Nice to see the Duran and the wider dissident sphere meeting in the middle here. Please do a follow-up soon. I would love to do a follow-up.
I would love to do a follow-up.
Yeah.
Tour de force describes it perfectly.
I think there's a lot to get into. Yeah, absolutely. A lot more
45
detail. 45
very intense minutes, if I can say.
Sparky says, Viva George Galloway.
Yeah.
And finally, user 1990 says, do you suppose Captain Ritter savagely headbutted and bit the federal thugs who attempted to detain him without cause?
No, I don't think
On the passport issue. Yeah.
The passport issue. I mean, I don't know what actually happened in terms of the removal of him from the plane, but whatever happened at that moment. I mean, what has happened is appalling. I gather Judge Napolitano has experienced the same thing. To me, it has a look of panic about it. Actually.
Has a look at.
I mean, it's Justin Trudeau, doing that. It's ugly. Right. I mean, it's over. I mean, he goes to Moscow to attend another conference. I mean, a wise elite would not care. I mean, they wouldn't bother. But Here they go. This is how they are. They have to haul him off the plane, take away his passport, engage in completely unconstitutional acts, do those sort of things. It will
Can I
not
make a
go on.
No, no, go on.
No, I
They,
mean,
they
it's
will
not
not.
going to work. It's going to turn out. It's not going to turn out well for them. That's what I'm
Yeah,
saying.
I completely agree. My guess is that if the Switzerland conference was not crumbling the way it's crumbling, they wouldn't have done this. I think they want to make sure, given everything that's happening with their conferences, especially the one in Switzerland, the Peace Formula Conference, they want to make sure that the St. Petersburg Forum is tarnished, is diminished, is humiliated, because I think they got really bothered with the turnout or the lack of turnout for the Swiss Peace Formula thing. That's my hunch. I don't know.
I entirely agree, but the whole Swiss Formula plan conference was an absurd one from the start. Why did they ever imagine that it would work? And I mean, if they're really getting angry and are hauling Scott Ritter and Judge Napolitano off planes and taking their passports away, well, all I can say is, I mean, they're completely disconnected from reality. Both the public
They are.
I mean, anyway, it shows. I mean, it's another symptom, if you like, of elite decline.
Yeah, they are. They are. One sec. We got some more that came in. ABBCE, thank you for that super chat. Angry Warhawk says Britain has been a plutocracy since 1649.
This is when the king was executed, I think, if I'm right.
Yeah.
Charles I.
Charles I. Utis4321 says, what do you think of Douglas McGregor's efforts to create an organization to crystallize a counter elite?
I'm not familiar with it, so it's something I'd have to learn more about.
Yeah, I agree. I haven't really read much about it. Commander Crossfire says, any thoughts on the New Mexico president?
No, I haven't. Again, somebody asked me yesterday, but I just haven't had the time to catch up on this. I don't think Alex said it yesterday in a program. I don't think it's going to make any difference to Mexico's overall political orientation. But I need to follow up this a lot more deeply than I have.
Sparky says, in many places, organized crime is more organized than the government.
Well, it's true enough.
And Sparky says Ritter went hard against Israel, so like with TikTok, they stepped it up against him.
Well, maybe, but I think
maybe I don't think so. I don't think that's the case.
I think it's about Russia, really. I think that's the real obsession.
I think it's Russia, the St. Petersburg Forum, and everything that's going bad for their events. Yeah, that's what I think it is. But we'll see. We'll see. Who knows?
We'll see.
Either way, I agree with you, Alexander. It's definitely an act of panic. Doesn't look good. That wasn't the best thing for them to do. That's everything, I believe. Your final thoughts, Alexander, while I just
it's a fantastic program, as I said, and I very much look forward to having Dr. Parvini again.
Yep. It would be great to have him back. All right. Thank you to everyone that joined us on Rockfin, on Odyssey, on Rumble, YouTube, and to our amazing community at theduran.locals.com. Thank you to our moderators, Reckless Abandon, Zarael, Peter, and I think that's everyone that was moderating for today. Thank you for everything that you do. Have a great, what is it today? Tuesday. Have a great Tuesday, everybody.
Tuesday.
Take care.
Take care.